Mustapha and Masood, if I may, to expand a little bit in various directions into this first panel and in crucial directions. I think let's have a conversation on 3 points. I think it'd be really good to hear from Mustapha first, perhaps, about the equation that our rulers have in their head between stability short term and potential long term, and how could that arithmetic possibly change? Then we'll move to Hanan on how to attract finance, because we need to finance all this. And then I'd love Masood to bring this to the global agenda. How can the global agenda help, and how can the region participate in the global conversation in ways that are helpful? So let's build on that. But let's start with you, Mustapha. How can this calculus change?
Thank you, Ishac. I think I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to go through the tour. And I'm going to make a comment on Jihad, what Jihad just said. I think what he said is very important, and I think the messages are clear, are strong. Unfortunately, the practice is not there. The Commission, one of the messages of the Commission is the need for a social dialogue, domestic social dialogue, which maps out the choices, maps out the medium term, and so on. Unfortunately, the way the IMF programs are done is completely different. The way the IMF programs, as today, what they are being done in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Egypt, and so on, they are done in dark rooms. There's no information about that. There is no debate about these programs. I speak for Tunisia, which I'm following somewhat, not that much, because I don't have information. Actually, there is very little information about what's going on. There is no debate about the issues. There is no domestic debate. The only debate is the IMF going to help or not help? Is it going to support or not support? And you have views on that. There is debate for and against, obviously, but on the content itself, on the choices, on what are we trying to achieve, there is very little known, very little we can discuss about. So this, I think, makes it very difficult to map out the medium term that Jihad was so much concerned about the structural reforms that are needed, that go beyond stabilization. There's very little of that discussion. So, so this leads me to answer your question in a way, because it's related to that. I think the Commission view, and I think there is consensus on that, is okay. We need, which is a very appealing proposition for policymakers, for politicians, not policymakers. Let me politicians as such. The option today for countries which are on the brink of financial crisis is have as little as possible of austerity to achieve stabilization, and as much as possible of structural reforms to stimulate growth. That's a winning proposition for policymakers, actually. It's a very attractive one. And you ask yourself, okay, if this is the case, if it's an attractive proposition, why does it resonate with the politicians? Why politicians don't take it, don't grab it and run with it? Why don't they do it? And so you ask yourself, why this contradiction, if you like? The politics, the political solution, actually the political package is very clear and very attractive, but it's not taken, actually. Policymakers try first to avoid austerity at any cost. They don't want. And they don't want to talk about structural reforms as much. Structural reforms to deal with the fiscal problems that Jihad was talking about, or to deal with the growth problems that we are talking about as well. And the question is why? I'm asking myself this question exactly. Why is this so? Actually, it turns out from policymakers' point of view that austerity is more attractive than structural reforms, because austerity is easy to understand. You can get the results very quickly. You cut expenditures, you solve this, problems. You cut wage bill if you can, and you cut this, and you cut subsidies if you can, as much as you can, and so on. But structural reforms are very uncertain, actually. Policymakers don't see the link between structural reforms and growth, actually. It's very difficult to sell a proposition that if you do these structural reforms, this 1, 2, 3, 4, then you are going to get, after so much time, so much growth. We don't have that information. I think as economists, actually, and international organization, by the way, all of this, including you, Hanan, here, actually, we don't have very little practical knowledge to sell to the policymakers on the link between reforms and growth. We have some idea. We know that structural reforms eventually will produce growth. We know that, okay. But how much and when, we don't know. We have very little knowledge about that. And we, as economists, we have been failing to provide that, that argument, that thing that can motivate and make policymakers grab the package and run with it. Policymakers are risk averse. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to create disturbances for the system. So status quo is the preferred solution. So if they want to do structural reforms, they are disruptive structural reforms. They're costly, and they don't know what they will produce, how will it affect the political equilibrium, actually. And in addition to that, they don't know when they will get the benefits. Maybe after their term, if they're elected, democratically. But if they are not elected democratically, maybe it will be the cause of their, being kind of taken out of power.
Right.
So I think, so my call here, my message, I will stop because we don't have much time, is something to us as economists and to international organizations, really to think about that. It's not enough. We have to stop talking about do this, do that, do structural reform, do this, do that, and then and you don't provide the evidence that they're going to get the benefits that you are telling them they will get and when they will get them. Unless we do that, unless we improve our knowledge, I think we are going to be missing the boat, and we are going to be losing on the losing side. Policymakers are not going to follow us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mustapha. I made a big mistake as chair here. I didn't introduce you. I don't have your CV in my head, but the first time we met, you were Minister of the Economy, I believe, in Tunisia, a long time ago.
Planning, yeah.
Planning. And then you were Chief Economist for the Middle East region at the World Bank, the next time I met you, I think. Yeah. And now you are in Tunisia. You were recently head of the Central Bank. You're very involved in domestic debate. You wrote a book and a second book. You ran for presidency. You want to change that country. And I know that Jihad too keeps calling for social debates. Policy is risky all over the world. So I think if we get to a second round, I want to ask you, how come the political parties don't put pressure on politicians, on the ruling regimes, to focus on the economy and to innovate? So let's try to get to a second round. Hanan, Morsi, we met, you were at the EBRD. I know you were before at the IMF. Then we met through Zoom several times. You were high up at the African Development Bank. And now you are in Addis Ababa, very high up, very close to the top of the UNECA. And so you're focusing very much now on African issues and on debt problems in particular. So when you look at the debt issues that we talked about a little bit here, and then we ask ourselves, we need actually capital flows to get these economies closer to their potential. And of course, as Roberta said, much more efficiency in the use of capital. So how do you see potential progress given this complicated balance sheet?
Thank you, Ishac. It's a pleasure to be here. I think perhaps let me start by the context where we got here, and the context of how we got to the debt levels that we arrived at is actually a global context that was actually characterized by very low, historically low interest rates. And also at a time that there was the Arab Spring in the region. There was a lot of socioeconomic pressures. So all this, basically led to the build-up of debt. Meanwhile, the current global context have really changed massively. Now we have, a much higher interest rate. We have, tightening by key central banks, and we have capital reversals from developing and emerging markets. So the context have massively changed, and at the same time, the whole world has been prone to a tsunami of global shocks. So the needs have massively increased, but the sources of financing are dwindling. So that leads to the issue that there is no escape for the need of actually consolidation. This is the reality that we'll have to go through. The issue is, how do we actually do it in a way that does not lead to more socio-political instability in the region? And here comes the issue of the quality of this consolidation. You want to make sure that you ring fence the social safety nets, improve the targeting of the social safety net programs, enhance the efficiency of the spending. In many countries, this has been part of the problem of how things got there. And there is no escape of doing it. It's how, and it's going to be very country specific. So, in Tunisia, for example, we have a huge issue with the size of the wage bill. A key issue would be needing to do a civil service reform. You have also a lot of issues with state-owned enterprises in a number of countries. I remember a few years ago, I did like a piece on state-owned enterprise in Tunisia. There were 105 state-owned enterprises across all sectors, including in things that are like not even in tobacco. You would not expect. Yeah, exactly. So there are many issues that will need to be really handled. Going forward then, in this current environment, what needs to be done? So one is, I think it depends on where the country is. So there are countries that are already in that distress. They'll have to go through that restructuring. They'll have to, find the, solutions and so on to get out. But there are the countries that are actually not there yet. There need to be basically the tools to actually reduce the cost of financing. And I think related to this is work that we have been doing in ECA through a high-level working group on global financial architecture with the African ministers of finance, which actually include 4 countries out of the 6. And we've been actually advocating for a number of changes. Some of them are related to, things at the IMF, for example, and which actually affect 2 of these countries, issues of waiving surcharges. So if these countries, number of them will need IMF programs. The current design actually, because of the size of the financing that they will need, they will, it will significantly increase the cost of their financing because of that. For example, for Egypt, it's almost leads to double the cost because of this, double of the cost of servicing that debt, according to the calculation. If that surcharges, if they reach the level by which these charges apply. So this has been one of the asks, but also there were a number of other things that relate to the current architecture. So, the eligibility for the G20 common framework. Middle income countries are not currently eligible. You need to have tools that actually enable you to handle the issue before you hit the wall. You need to have eligibility or application upon application of a G20 common framework that you have a debt standstill
Yeah.
So there is actually a framework by which actually you can see some sort of a time-bound process that encourages countries to get in, but also there is increasingly more interest across African countries, including also in Egypt, to look into instruments such as debt for climate swaps, right, green finance. And there is, huge potential for the continent to do more of that, but we need to have the international mechanism to support it, meaning a lot of the cases that have been done so far have been for small countries. Mainly, a lot of the finance or the concessional elements came from NGOs. To bring it to scale, you need this to be supported at a higher level. Perhaps one of the things that we also put forward in the discussion with ministers and later on in discussion with management is the issue of thinking about the RST tool at the IMF as a catalyst,
and sustainability
exactly,
funds,
as a catalyst, how it can be as a catalyst to actually bring further green finance, right, either through innovative products or through this debt for climate swaps, a sort of like guarantees credit enhancement elements that would be much needed. I can talk more, but I know I want to make sure
absolutely.
that.
No, I mean, this is super. You took us from the local to the global, which is where I wanted to take Masood. Masood Ahmed, thanks for being with us. First time I met you, you were my director of research in the research department of the World Bank long time ago. And then you moved through the whole world, right? To the IMF, to England, to DFID, right? And now you have your hands on the core global issues that Hanan talked about at the Center for Global Development, where you have an amazing program. The same way the Middle East Institute has an amazing program on the Middle East. So what would you want to say to respond to Hanan in terms of what the changes in the global architecture that are needed for the Middle East to also help itself out of the tough place in which it is? And how come we don't hear enough the Middle East voice in those global debates where you're a central actor?
Thank you very much, Ishac. And we've had some really insightful interventions. So I'm going to be very brief and just pick up on 3 points, some of which are just picking up on what others have said. First thing I think it's worth saying, though, is just take a minute to think about what the world is going to look like over the next 2 years, because it's in that context that we'll be doing this conversation. And basically, this is a bad year. Next year will be worse. And we're going to have continued high inflation. Everyone's focus will be in the advanced economies on bringing inflation down. That's going to be #1 priority. So they're going to keep interest rates high. Financial markets will therefore not be very open to emerging markets. And growth's going to come down. There'll be recession in Europe. There'll probably be recession in the US. China's going to slow down a lot. So that's the big picture within which we're going to be looking at the Middle East for the next 2 years. What does that mean? I think it means for me is be realistic in terms of what you can get done. The Europeans in particular are going to be very much focused on energy security for themselves. It's going to have a harsh winter, it'll be a worse winter next year for them. Their focus will be on Ukraine and the East. So we have to be realistic and we have to be opportunistic. And I think there are 2 areas of international debate which are going to move forward in the next 2 years. And that's where both of them are relevant for the Middle East. First is going to be around climate change, renewable energy, green finance. The IMF's got an RST, the Resilient Sustainability Trust. We're going to have half a dozen countries done by February. I'm not sure there are any Middle Eastern countries in the current list that I see. Maybe there'll be one. I think there's a World Bank is going to be shifting a lot of its energy and the MDBs onto green finance, on climate change, on what they can do to mobilize private money through guarantees and the like for climate. So I would say, really, this is an opportunity where if you want to push for trying to see some agenda for growth in the near term, put a lot of energy behind that. Second area is going to be debt. Debt, we all talk about a lot. I spent a lot of my life worrying about debt issues and debt framework. Basically, we talk, but we don't act. The bottom line is every 6 months, we have ever more articulate presentations of how dire the problem is and how urgent it is to resolve the issue and what needs to be done to resolve the issue. But basically, for political reasons, we're not able to bring together the official creditors, which include China and Paris Club and official agencies in a way that they can work together. And private creditors also have not been very forthcoming. So far, we've had these 3 countries that have been going through one framework, which is this G20 common framework. You have a few countries that are outside the framework that are trying to find individual solutions. I'm not convinced that there's going to be a huge change in the framework in the next 2 years. So my advice to countries would be, if you haven't got a debt, if you've got a debt problem like Lebanon or Sudan does, you're already in the middle of it, you're trying to deal with it. But if you haven't yet, and I think Egypt and Tunisia, the two that are the most furthest out there in the region, with sort of Jordan a little bit further behind, I would say, think now about what is the strategy that you want to have to manage the debt issue. And I'm not sure. I mean, there are people who are much more involved with the countries than I am, but don't assume that it'll get taken care of. I think you need a much more proactive game plan on what you're going to do. And the most important thing about it is don't make random comments about your debt. I think the thing that really hurts a lot of countries, and I speak in a broad definition of the region for this, is when you have policymakers coming forward and making comments about it'd be a really good idea to get debt forgiveness or debt restructuring, because all it does is that it spooks the markets, pushes up your spreads, and does zero for getting you debt forgiveness or debt restructuring. It has no impact on your objective. It only increases your cost. So I think exchange rates and debt are 2 issues on which my personal view is, less said the better unless you've got a game plan. And the final, so I would say on that, you could move forward. The last thing I want to say in 1 minute is, Mustapha very rightly pointed out that, politicians don't act on structural reform sometimes because they're not quite sure about the link between those reforms and growth. And even the term structural reforms, what does it mean to anybody? It's very abstract. But sometimes, and I think more often than perhaps we'd like to admit, the reason politicians don't act is because the current low growth equilibrium in which many of the countries of our region are stuck is actually a pretty good equilibrium for the elite. So the elite actually doing quite well in this equilibrium. The things that you need to do, and some of them I think you do know what needs to be done. A country like Pakistan, for example, the same applies to many countries in the region. You've got public enterprises, the big loss makers. You know what to do about them, but it's very hard to tackle them. You've got tax to GDP ratios that are low because very few people are in the tax space. You know how to bring more people into it, but they're actually politically quite important people. Or you've got state enterprises in Egypt that sort of crowd out private enterprises and don't create competition. So I think the real question, which it would be great for the Commission to ask, to focus on next, is not just the how of what needs to be done, but also how do you shift from the current low growth equilibrium that actually suits the elite. And there's a little bit, some of you may have been following Stefan Durkon's recent book, which is about the elite bargain, which is sort of formalizes this point a bit of saying that you really only move when the elite in a country are convinced that it's in their interest to move forward. And I'm not convinced that in many of our countries in the region, we have reached the point where there is that commitment to tackle the constraints to move forward. And of course, the harder the macro, the fund really can only do macro in the end. The harder the macro, the more difficult it is to focus on these things because your whole attention gets shifted on short-term firefighting. And I think our finance ministers spend way too much time firefighting and balancing their books, and therefore not enough time on really thinking through a growth strategy. So let me stop with that, Isaac.
Thank you, Masood. This is all very thoughtful, and indeed, for most of us that have been working for years and decades on the Middle East, this has been the situation. The liberalization of the 80s has been a very unbalanced liberalization that quickly led to an environment in which they were pretty comfortable, with big businesses with privileges that they were allied with. But then came the Arab Spring in 2011, and then came a decade of chaos. And now we are at a situation where this model is unsustainable, is about to explode financially. That's what this report is saying. And the question now is whether these regimes can understand that way of doing business is not going to be available in the future. This low equilibrium will have to become a very low equilibrium, a la Lebanon, literally, for if no change happens. And so we're back maybe with a concluding thought, because I saw you were trying to think again about how civil society, perhaps Indonesia could mobilize to put pressure actually for politicians to think harder by themselves. And you don't need a blueprint to move. You need to put a process together that finds a solution, right? You need to focus on how to get out of this trap.
Ishac, I am known for being rather pessimist. Okay, because I see things the way they are really, and not try to. Now, you ask me why there is no pressure on politicians to move in the right direction. Well, I tell you, there is a lot of pressure on politicians to do things. But unfortunately for you and for me, they're not the ones that you think are the right things to do. The pressures that the politicians face are to do things that you think they should not do. Politicians in Tunisia today for the last 10 years, and I have said this to my old friend Shanta Devarajan, who was in the MENA region chief economist, and he tried to sell this idea of the new social contract. And the new social contract that he likes himself, that he has developed in the bank, that says, okay, we don't want the government to be on our backs politically. We want to be free, but at the same time, we're going to free the economy. Okay, we're going to eliminate subsidies. We're going to have, competition and so on. But the people don't like that. They don't like to take away the subsidies. Nobody in the political arena will be pushing for eliminating the subsidies. Very few people actually will dare, say that. And politicians and political parties, even the opposition, will come and say we eliminate subsidies. Very little, very few people. Very few will come and say, okay, public SOEs were loss making and so on. Let's get rid of them or something.
So we economists should be talking to the opposition before talking to the rulers.
Exactly.
Very good.
Because there is no social consensus on what needs to be done, really, on this. That's why these debates have to be really deep and have to be thoughtful and have to be long-term, as Jihad said. I mean, I agree. It's not something that you can do it very quickly. Tunisia, this has not been happening. This has not taken place. I tried in 2016. 2016, it was after there was the new constitution, and there was a new government, you were expecting maybe we are going to take a good path and so on. So at that time, we organized, as economists, a conference. We called it the Fundamental Economic and Social Choices for the Country. And we had working papers on different issues on the state and bureaucracy, the public sector, the public enterprises, on this and that and so on. And we had this, and we tried to bring the politicians. Some politicians came, but most did not. starting with the government itself. The government undermined and the labor union undermined what we are trying to do. Even though they were invited to get into this debate as labor union, but the labor union in Tunisia did not like that. Did not like that we posed these issues outside. So it failed, this experiment. We tried exactly to do this. Okay, there was a window of opportunity for us. At the time we saw there was a window of opportunity to get a debate on these long-term issues, on these basic choices. How do we like the private sector to be? What kind of private sector we want? What kind of public sector we want?
Right.
What kind of social contract we want? Really, we wanted to open these discussions. And now I think since 2006, I think the situation has gotten worse. There is even less debate
16.
about this. 16 up to now, 6 years.
Yeah.
The debate has even gone worse. It's now we discuss, other, strange ideas about, I mean, I don't want to get too much into these details, but it's very difficult. I mean, politically, I mean, what the commission, I support fully what the commission is trying to say in terms of the need for that. But how to go and do it actually is really very, very difficult.
It has to be country by country, and I think that's your next step.
Yes,
That's the next step, very much so, yeah. And I think that's also the period where the region is. 2011, there was a sense in civil society that one could jump from hell to paradise. And somehow civil society has grown out of this. And it seems to me should be more ready than in 2016 to focus on more realistic debates on actual issues and reforms that need to be discussed, as opposed to how to, what kind of paradise it wants. And possibly the private sector could be more ready because, the big cronies have learned their lesson. They end up mostly expropriated and in jail. The rule of law should be much better for them. So, hopefully we are moving to a place where social coordination among actors for kind of win-win deals, as opposed to Shanta's type of social bargains, would be possible. And I hope, just to conclude, that the international organization would keep pushing for more social debates and would make that offer more serious actually and more constraining. And more importantly, I think it's really on us, civil societies in the region, to actually push for this to happen, because it has to start inside. We took a few more minutes than planned. Thank you for being here. This has been super. And thanks, Paul, for hosting us.